Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 6 of the Raccoon Club podcast. You know, I realized that I never got a chance to ever tell you guys why I called the Raccoon Club the Raccoon Club. It was actually part of an in-joke that a few friends and I had about, we were talking about the future of humanity once. And I'm completely pessimistic. I think it's time as a species that we simply pack it up and move on. I always used to joke around that I think the rightful inheritors of civilization should be raccoons, because I think they have all the skill necessary. I think they're smart. I think they have the hands for it. And it's days like today that make me feel that I'm right about everything. So we just got off of 4 or 5 days after the Nazi riots in Charlottesville, after watching the President of the United States go on national television and defend Nazis and create false equivalencies between Nazis and people who fight against Nazis. And you'd think in a normal world, in a world where we had morals and values, in a world where as a species we're supposed to be the most evolved creatures, you'd think that that would mean trouble for the president. Turns out, no. Today, new polling comes out from Quinnipiac that shows that Donald Trump's approval rating in the last 7 days, including over the period where there were the riots and his statements after the riots and his press conference where he melted down, and again, that whole false equivalency thing, his approval ratings went up. New polling conducted by Quinnipiac says that in the last 7 days, in a national telephone survey done from August 9th to August 15th, Donald Trump's ratings went up from 33% to 39%. Now, I wish I can say I'm shocked. I'm actually not. When Trump said what he did, I remember turning, a buddy of mine were having coffee, and the day after, I remember turning to him and saying his approval rating is going to go up, because I've always been convinced that underneath America, there really is a white supremacist problem. Like I said, I wish I can say I'm stunned. I'm not. But it ties into something that I talked about a couple of podcasts ago. I don't see any reason whatsoever why the GOP as a national party has any reason to be any more inclusive or any more tolerant than it absolutely has to be, because their own political base doesn't need it. A stunning 81% of Republicans from the same Quinnipiac poll expressed approval for the president. 81% of Republican voters, 8 out of 10, think that the president's doing an incredible job. They approve of him. So if you're a Republican senator, if you're a Republican House member, and you just got these polls, and this was after everything that Donald Trump said and after the political firestorm, what incentive do you have to put out an olive branch to the African American community? What incentive do you have to moderate your immigration policies? What incentive do you have to forge a kind of conservative party that may win national elections regularly? You don't, because your base has told you 8 out of 10 Republican voters approve of what Donald Trump is doing. That is insanely high for political support within a party. Like, Donald Trump is doing extraordinarily well with the GOP base. But again, it comes back to the problem that I've been mentioning, that how does the GOP party moderate itself? How do you get into a situation where one political party is not going to be the party of white supremacy, which is essentially what the GOP has become? Like, if you look at their policies, if you look at their immigration policies, if you look at their economic policies, they are clearly a party for and by white people. There's just no other way to do it. There's no other way to describe that party. And what's really stunning about that Quinnipiac poll was that 58%, so almost 60% of all Republican voters, actually said that they don't expect Trump or Congress to pass any meaningful legislation this year. So GOP voters are giving Trump an 80% approval rating, and 60% of them basically said, yeah, we also don't expect you guys to actually get anything done this year. What incentive do you have if you're a senator or a House member of the GOP to do anything positive for this country, given those ratings? It actually gets worse. It actually gets worse. I mentioned about Donald Trump's statements about Charlottesville and the riots and that press conference that he had where he melted down. Almost 70%, 67% of Republicans, and this is according to a CBS poll, 67% of Republicans say they approve of Donald Trump's response to it. And 68% say he was describing the events accurately. What incentive do you have if you are a GOP politician to do anything in regards to white supremacy with those kinds of, like, I wish I can say I'm surprised I'm not. I've said this for the longest time, that the GOP is structurally built as a white supremacist party. And again, going back to my previous podcast, white supremacy is not about burning crosses. It is not about Nazi flags. It is not about hoods and robes. White supremacy is about having white people exclusively as the center of gravity in the economic, political, and social dynamics of a country. And that's exactly what the GOP party is. That's exactly what the GOP is. I remember after President Obama won his first term in 2008, 2009, the GOP did this sort of internal autopsy, and they released a report where they talked about how they needed to sort of be more open, have a greater outreach to Latinos and to African Americans. And then a month later, the Tea Party movement kicked off. And that report was buried and it was never used. They actually had a whole game plan where they sat down and said, you know what, we really need to start making inroads with African Americans and Latinos, or demographically we're never going to be able to win elections because the math will never add up. And then the Tea Party picks off and that report was buried. They have no intention now because they can't. They are a party whose base is in former Confederate states. If you are a GOP consultant and you are hired to try and create an outreach program to grow the base beyond the South, what can you do? What plan do you have that will allow you to both grow outside of the South while still protecting your base of voters? You can't have it. It's not going to happen. And even after everything that's happened this week, according to a Reuters poll of 755 Trump voters, 60% of them said that the country is going in the right direction. So let's understand let's recap the first 6 months of Donald Trump's presidency. No healthcare legislation, no tax legislation, no infrastructure legislation, no manufacturing legislation. We're coming up on the debt ceiling. Nothing done there. He has literally accomplished nothing. And he's created controversy after controversy after controversy. He's embarrassed the office of the presidency. He's embarrassed the nation. He's taken the sides of neo-Nazis. And 60% of Republican voters think the country is going in the right direction. If you are a GOP senator or House representative, you have nothing to worry about. You're probably going to be reelected. You're probably going to be reelected. Why would you sweat this? After all of this, if you're still polling 60% right direction, you're laughing. This is gravy for you. In theory, it only gets easier from here, assuming he doesn't do anything else stupid for the rest of the year. I mentioned about how I have very little confidence in the human race, and this is one of the reasons why I don't. Because no matter where you go in the world, you have around 25 to 40% of any given country that has just completely disconnected themselves from reality. In the States, it's a conservative wing. In Canada, it's also the conservative wing. But in other countries, it's different philosophies and different spectrums of politics and religion and ideology. But for whatever reason, it always seems to be a 30 or 40% mix that seem completely divorced from the realities on the ground and from the world that we have to build, not the world that we have now, that the world that's going to make sense for our children, not the world that made sense for us or our grandparents or our parents. And in the States, the GOP represents that 35 to 40% that is going to refuse to acknowledge global warming, that's going to refuse to take seriously LGBTQ issues, that's going to refuse to admit that they have a white supremacist problem as a nation and that African Americans and Latinos are being disproportionately affected by it, are being marginalized, are being left out in the cold from the political, the economic, and the social systems of the states. And this is a nation that has the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world, that has the largest economy, that has the largest banks, that has their hands on all the major levers of economics, of military, of diplomacy, of trade, of science globally. The fact that the dollar is the de facto currency of the globe, yet 40% of that country will walk lockstep with Donald Trump over the cliff. And unfortunately, at that percentage, they take everyone else down with them. These poll numbers also highlight something else. And once again, it's that issue of false equivalency, where if you listen to the news media talk, they said, Americans are very disappointed in Donald Trump. So what they'll do is they'll say, over 60% of Americans disapprove of Donald Trump, making it sound like it is a sort of bipartisan rejection of Donald Trump. No, it's not. 8 out of every 10 Republican voters support and approve of Donald Trump. This is not a bipartisan thing. This is not a bipartisan issue. The only reason that number is at 60% is because Democrats are voting 94% disapproval on Trump. The only reason why the numbers about Donald Trump's response to Charlottesville seems negative is because Democrats overwhelmingly disapprove of the statements. The GOP voters are absolutely fine by it. Most politicians would be thrilled to have approval ratings in the 60s. He's got approval ratings internally at 81%. Most politicians would be laughing their heads off and doing backflips after the week that Donald Trump had to have his national ratings go up by 6%. The idea that somehow, and the idea that the media presents, or actually scratch that, the problem that the media doesn't present, they refuse to point the spotlight at the Republican Party and saying, you guys are the ones that are messed up. It's not everyone else. Everyone else thinks that Nazis are bad, and everyone else thinks that any kind of false equivalency that includes Nazis is bad. But they don't do that. So they have these panels on their shows that makes it look like it's a balanced discussion. It is not a balanced discussion. It is not a balanced discussion. They showcase Republican senators and House members sort of disapprovingly saying things about Donald Trump. Doesn't matter. Your base doesn't disapprove. 70% of your base thinks that he not only did the right thing and said the right thing,